It started like any other day. A wife, a mother, a sheriff sworn to uphold the law. But what she walked in on that night would change everything. A small Texas town, the kind where neighbors greet each other by name, where the sound of children laughing echoes down quiet streets, where a uniform carries weight, and justice is more than just a word. A place that seemed safe until the unthinkable happened. She had spent years protecting others, making split-second decisions in the name of justice. She had faced criminals, held the line between order and chaos. But nothing, not her training, not her instincts, could have prepared her for what she found inside her own home. A door left slightly open, a sound that didn't belong, a moment where time slowed, where her entire world narrowed to a single, horrifying realization. And in that moment, the law didn't matter. The badge didn't matter. The rules, the procedures, none of it mattered. Something inside her broke. And what happened next would send shockwaves far beyond that quiet Texas town. Tonight, we take you inside a crime so shocking, so brutal, that it left even the toughest investigators speechless. Sheriff Regina Holt had spent years earning the trust and respect of her small Texas town. She was a woman of discipline, sharp instincts, and an unwavering sense of justice. Whether it was chasing down criminals, handling domestic disputes, or standing tall in the courtroom, Regina was known for her no-nonsense approach to the law. People relied on her. They trusted her. But at home, Regina wasn't just a sheriff, she was a mother and a wife. A woman who had built a life she believed was solid, unshakable. Her job demanded long hours, tough decisions, and sacrifices, but she always made time for her family. Especially for her daughter, Lillian, her bright-eyed, curious 11-year-old who had a habit of asking too many questions and always wanted to tag along with her mother. Lillian adored Regina, and Regina adored her right back. She would have done anything to protect her. Her husband, Marcus Holt, was a well-respected man in the community. A familiar face at town events, a friendly neighbor, and a man who knew how to say the right things to the right people. He had charm, an easy smile, and a reputation as a devoted family man. People saw him grilling in the backyard on weekends, waving at passers-by, always willing to lend a hand when someone needed it. But reputations are fragile things. Because behind closed doors, Marcus Holt was not the man the town thought he was. At first, it was easy to dismiss the small changes in Lillian. The way her laughter faded. The way she hesitated before answering questions. The way she started keeping her door locked at night. Regina chalked it up to growing pains. Every child goes through phases, right? But something about it didn't sit right. Regina had spent years studying criminals. Liars, manipulators, men who thought they were untouchable. She had interrogated them, watched them crumble under the weight of their own guilt. But never, not once, did she think she would come home to one. Marcus had a secret. A dark, disgusting secret he thought he had buried deep enough to never be discovered. But secrets have a way of unraveling. No one in town suspected a thing. Because monsters don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they sit at the dinner table. Sometimes they kiss their wives goodnight. Sometimes they wear the face of a man who swore to love and protect. And Marcus had no idea that the woman he had underestimated was about to make him pay. That night, Sheriff Regina Holt was supposed to be working late. A case had come in earlier that morning, a routine burglary that needed follow-up reports, statements from witnesses, the usual paperwork that kept her chained to her desk long after the sun had set. But something told her to go home. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was intuition. Or maybe, deep down, she already knew. She pulled into the driveway, cutting the engine of her patrol car. The house stood in front of her, still and quiet, bathed in the dim glow of the porch light. Too quiet. Regina knew this house. She knew every creaky floorboard, every hum of the old air conditioning unit, every soft murmur of life that usually filled it. But tonight, something was off. Her boots barely made a sound as she stepped inside. The air was thick, unmoving. The scent of home-cooked dinner still lingered in the air, mixing with something else. Something stale. Something is wrong. And then she heard it. A noise. Faint, muffled, almost indistinguishable. But it was there. A sound that made her heart slam against her ribs. A sound she couldn't ignore. Her hand instinctively moved to her hip, grazing the holster of her service weapon. She didn't unclip it, not yet. Instead, she listened. A shuffle. A whimper. The creak of a mattress. Every nerve in her body went cold. The hallway stretched in front of her, the familiar family photos lining the walls now feeling foreign, distant. The house she had built, the life she had lived, it all suddenly felt like a lie. One foot in front of the other, she moved toward the noise. The door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar, a sliver of dim light spilling into the darkness. The bedroom. Lillian's bedroom. Regina's breath hitched. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. She pushed the door open and froze. For a moment, the world stopped. The air left her lungs. The ground beneath her feet ceased to exist. There, on the bed, was Lillian, her little girl, her baby, the child she had sworn to protect. And above her, holding her down, was Marcus Holt, her husband, the man she had once trusted with her life. The moment their eyes met, Marcus jolted upright. Panic flashed across his face, a raw, unfiltered terror that told her everything she needed to know. He knew. He knew he had been caught. Regina, his voice cracked, the color draining from his face. His hands, the same hands that had once cradled their daughter as a newborn, were now trembling. Regina couldn't move. She couldn't speak. The air around her had thickened, pressing down on her chest like a weight. Her vision blurred, then sharpened again, focusing on every single disgusting detail, the way Marcus's body shielded Lillian's trembling form, the way her daughter's wide, tear-streaked eyes pleaded without words. She didn't need to ask what had happened. She didn't need to hear an explanation. The truth was laid out in front of her like a grotesque puzzle, its pieces clicking together with sickening clarity. A hot, searing rage ignited inside her, a fury so overwhelming it drowned out everything else. Marcus took a step toward her. "Regina, She pulled out her gun. The safety clicked off. For the first time in her career, Sheriff Regina Holt was no longer thinking about the law. No longer thinking about right or wrong, about procedures or consequences. She was thinking about justice. And she was about to deliver it herself. Regina's world had already shattered the moment she opened that door. The scene burned into her mind like a scar that would never fade. Her husband, Marcus, half-dressed, his face frozen in horror. And her daughter, her baby, cowering in the corner, tears streaming down her face. Regina didn't think. She acted. Her hand tightened around the gun. Her service weapon, the same one she had drawn countless times in the line of duty. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't pointing it at a criminal in the streets. This time, she was pointing it at the man she had once loved. Marcus's mouth opened, fumbling for excuses, for words that could somehow twist reality in his favor. "Regina, listen to me." She fired. The gunshot exploded through the room. The bullet tore into his abdomen, just below his ribs. A calculated shot, one that wouldn't kill him instantly. Marcus stumbled backward, his hand flying to the wound, blood seeping between his fingers. He gasped, his body shaking from the shock, his legs wobbling as he collapsed onto the floor. A weak groan left his lips. His breaths turned ragged. Regina could have stopped there. She could have let him bleed out, let the pain consume him slowly. But no, that wasn't enough. She turned and walked out of the room, leaving him writhing on the floor, his cries growing weaker. Marcus thought she was leaving. He thought she had changed her mind. But she wasn't done. She made her way to the kitchen, her movements eerily calm, methodical. She reached into the drawer and wrapped her fingers around the cold steel handle of a knife. A large, sharp knife. The kind that cuts deep. The kind that ensures no one ever forgets what was done to them. When she returned, Marcus had dragged himself against the bed, his breath shallow, sweat dripping down his face. His eyes met hers, pleading, desperate. "Regina, please." She didn't listen. She didn't hesitate. The first stab landed in his shoulder, the blade sinking deep into muscle. Marcus screamed. The second stab, his chest. The third, his stomach. Again, and again, and again. Each strike carried the weight of her daughter's stolen innocence. Each stab was a punishment, a reckoning, a message carved into his flesh. Blood sprayed across the walls, soaked the floor, turned the white sheets crimson. She didn't stop until she reached 23. And then, with her hands shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps, she looked down at the broken man in front of her. Barely alive, barely conscious. She knelt beside him, her voice eerily calm. "You don't deserve to be a man." And with a final, deliberate movement, she removed the very thing that made him one. Marcus's body convulsed, his screams turning into garbled, guttural cries. His entire world collapsed into agony, pain like he had never known. His body writhed, hands clawing at the sheets, at his ruined flesh. But there was no undoing what she had done. Regina stood, covered in his blood, her heart pounding in her chest. Justice had been served, and Marcus would never, ever hurt another soul again. The room was silent now, except for the shallow, ragged breaths coming from Marcus's broken body. Blood pooled beneath him, seeping into the cracks of the hardwood floor. The sheets were drenched, stained deep red. The metallic scent of iron filled the air, thick and suffocating. Regina stood over him, her hands slick with his blood, the knife still clutched in her fingers. Her chest rose and fell with each labored breath. Her uniform, once a symbol of law and order, was now soaked in the evidence of what she had done. She should have felt relief. She should have felt satisfaction. But all she felt was exhaustion. Then, a whimper. Regina's eyes snapped to the corner of the room. Her daughter, Lillian, was curled into herself, knees tucked to her chest, rocking back and forth. Her small body trembled, silent tears streaking her face. Regina dropped the knife. It clattered against the floor, breaking the eerie silence. She rushed to her daughter, falling to her knees beside her, reaching out with blood-stained hands. But Lillian flinched. A small, almost imperceptible movement. Regina froze. Her heart twisted, a different kind of pain tearing through her, deeper than rage, deeper than grief. Her baby was afraid of her. She had done this for her, to protect her, to make sure she never lived in fear again. But in this moment, she had become something else, something terrifying. The weight of it all came crashing down. Her chest heaved. The room spun. Regina reached for her radio with shaking fingers, pressing the button with a numb kind of detachment. "Dispatch. I need units at my residence. Now." She let go of the button. The call had been made. There was no turning back. The sirens screamed through the night, flashing red and blue illuminating the darkened walls of the house. Tires screeched against the pavement. Then footsteps, heavy boots pounding against the ground. She simply sat there, holding her daughter, rocking her gently, whispering words that no longer seemed to matter. The front door burst open. Officers stormed inside, weapons drawn. And then they saw her, their sheriff, their friend, covered in blood. They saw Marcus, a barely breathing shell of the man he once was, mutilated beyond recognition. And they saw Lillian, wide-eyed, silent, caught between a nightmare and whatever came next. For a long moment, no one spoke. Regina met their eyes, one by one. She knew them. She trained some of them. She fought beside them. She was them. But now, she was something else. A criminal. A murderer. A mother who had done what the law could never do fast enough. One officer, a younger deputy, Manuel Cortez, finally moved. His hands trembled as he lowered his weapon. His voice cracked when he spoke. "Sheriff, what did you do?" Regina inhaled sharply. And then, she held out her wrists. A silent answer. Manuel hesitated. He turned to the others, waiting for a command, for someone to make the decision he couldn't. No one moved, because they all knew what Marcus had done. They all knew what she had walked in on. And a part of them, no matter how hard they tried to suppress it, understood. One of the senior officers, Captain Elijah Ross, stepped forward, his face unreadable. He exhaled, slow and heavy. Then, finally, "Cuff her." The words hit the room like a gunshot. Manuel stepped forward, his hands still shaking. He reached for the cuffs at his belt, hesitating for just a moment longer. Then he clicked them around her wrists. Cold steel against warm skin. Regina didn't fight. She didn't resist. She simply closed her eyes as the weight of justice, real justice, settled upon her shoulders. As they led her outside, past the flashing lights, past the gaping officers who still couldn't believe what they had walked into, a single thought echoed in her mind. Would they arrest her? Or let justice stand? The news spread like wildfire. By the time the sun rose over their small Texas town, the story had already escaped the walls of the sheriff's department. It was on every television screen, every radio station, every phone. The name Regina Holt was no longer just a name. It was a national debate. Murder or justice? The town was split. Neighbors, friends, even fellow officers whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of it all. "She's a hero," some said. "She did what any mother would have done." "She's a criminal," others argued. The law isn't meant to be personal. Inside the sheriff's office, where Regina had once commanded respect, her former colleagues sat in tense silence. Some avoided making eye contact with each other. Others clenched their jaws, knowing that no matter how this played out, there would be consequences. For them, for the department, for the entire legal system. And then there was Lillian, the 11-year-old girl at the center of it all. She hadn't spoken much since that night. Not to the social workers, not to the detectives, not even to the family members who came to check on her. She just stared ahead, silent, unmoving. When the cameras found her, flashing lights from the press outside the station, she barely reacted. Because what was left to say? Her father was dead. Her mother was in handcuffs. And the world wanted her to choose sides. Regina's first court appearance was unlike anything the town had ever seen. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, locals, legal experts from across the country who had flown in just to witness history in the making. The prosecution laid out the facts. Yes, Marcus Holt had done something monstrous. Yes, he had violated the most sacred trust a child could place in a father. But Regina hadn't just stopped him. She had tortured him. A gunshot to wound him, not kill him. 23 stab wounds. A mutilation that ensured his final moments were filled with nothing but pain. They called it overkill. They called it premeditation in the heat of passion. And then came the defense. They didn't deny what she did. They didn't ask for pity. Instead, they made the courtroom look at Lillian. "Tell me," her lawyer asked the jury, his voice slow, deliberate, unshaken. "If you walked into that room and saw what Regina saw, what would you have done?" The room fell silent. Psychologists were brought in to testify. Some spoke of trauma, of how a mother's instinct can override reason, of how some people break in the face of horror. Others warned about the dangers of vigilantism, of letting emotion dictate justice. And then came the real question. Does she deserve to be punished? Social media exploded. Hashtags took over the internet. Hashtag justice for Regina. Hashtag mothers don't forget. Hashtag let her go. They held signs with words Regina herself had never spoken aloud. She saved her daughter. But on the other side, former prosecutors, law professors, people who had spent their careers defending the system, reminding the world that the law had to be followed, even when it felt unbearable. Because if she walked free, what would stop others from doing the same? Weeks passed. The jury deliberated. Regina sat in her cell, staring at the concrete walls. She knew how this could end. Prison. Life. Maybe worse. But if she had to do it all over again, she wouldn't change a thing. The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension. Every breath felt heavier. Every second stretched longer. Regina Holt sat still, hands folded, gaze steady. The past few weeks had been a blur of legal arguments, media storms, and public outcry. But now, in this moment, it was just her, the judge, the jury, and the decision that would shape the rest of her life. The courtroom was packed. Reporters with cameras, townsfolk who had known Regina for years, strangers who had driven miles just to be here. Lillian sat in the front row, flanked by a court-appointed advocate. She hadn't spoken a word about that night since it happened, but now, as the jury foreman stood, her small hands clenched into fists. The judge gave a nod. The foreman cleared his throat. We, the jury, find the defendant. The silence that followed felt unbearable. Even Regina, who had spent her entire career in law enforcement, had never known a pause could feel this long. Not guilty, by reason of temporary insanity. A gasp rippled through the room. Some people exhaled in relief. Others murmured in frustration. Regina closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they landed on Lillian. The little girl's expression didn't change. No tears. No visible reaction. Just quiet. The judge banged the gavel, dismissing the court, but the ruling had already spilled beyond the wooden walls of the courtroom. Within minutes, headlines were flashing across TV screens and phone notifications. Texas sheriff acquitted of husband's killing. Justice or vigilantism? The Regina Holt trial ends in controversy. Mother walks free after deadly revenge, what this means for the legal system. But for the people inside that town, there was no closure. Some felt justice had been served that night, when Marcus Holt took his last, agonizing breath. They called Regina a mother who did what any mother would have done. Others saw something else, a much darker reality. If the law could be ignored when emotions ran high, where did that leave them? Would this open the door for more people to take justice into their own hands? Could others now claim temporary insanity in the heat of a crime? And what about Lillian, the little girl who had trusted her father and watched her mother destroy him? She had been saved from one horror, only to step into another. Would she remember her mother as a hero? Or would she grow up haunted by the image of a blood-soaked woman standing over the man she had once called Daddy? Regina stepped out of the courthouse, greeted by a sea of flashing lights, microphones, and voices screaming her name. She didn't stop. She didn't speak. She just walked. Lillian followed, her small hand slipping into her mother's. The world kept asking the same question. Was it justice? But maybe the real question was never about Regina. Maybe the real question was about us. About what we believe justice really is. What it should look like. How far we would go. Because the truth is, no one really knows what they would do. Until the moment everything changes.
If you found this case as shocking as I did, make sure to subscribe to True Crime Unmasked and turn on notifications so you never miss a new true crime documentary. There are always more stories to uncover, more lessons to be learned, and sometimes the truth is even darker than we can imagine.